Hello, this is the second of our 7 talks on the book of Micah. In the first talk, we heard that the whole book is very little preached on apart from purple passages. And looking at today's reading, the whole of Micah chapters 1 and 2, perhaps we can understand why. Places we never encounter in the rest of the Bible. References to people throwing others off land and out of houses, something I guess none of us or very few of us have had to do, and even preachers who advertise the local pubs. It seems a world away from us in 2022, but let's have another look at this and see what we can see, because I've titled my talk Mainly Bad News. You can probably see the slides now. And of course, mainly bad news is what we watch most nights on the television. The difference being, of course, that what we watch is mainly bad news happening to other people. So we may well feel horror, pity, or anger, but thankfully we are distanced from it ourselves. It's someone else's problem. But here, Micah is delivering a hard message to his own people, the Jews. Now, Jewish society in that period being much more of a theocracy than ours is today, we might avoid making simplistic comparisons, and we may justifiably conclude that we don't practice any of the things that I'm going to look at in chapters 1 and 2. But nevertheless, this is a message for us, God's own people. That's what the last speaker said in the first talk we had to reckon with when he opened the talks on Micah. And in trying to come to terms with these tricky questions, I found myself challenged by a number of questions. Can God's people ever be beyond hope? Can God really devise evil? And what's an appropriate attitude for a preacher bringing judgment? I think Micah addresses these questions here, which for me anyway are added reasons for studying the passage. I can't promise easy or complete answers, but hope to throw a little light on those questions and on the passages as a whole. I've divided up the passage into 5 sections, which you can see on the screen, but I want to keep us in mind of Micah's key themes that emerge through the book a little bit later on, as we'll see. That famous verse, "And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. So let's begin with a recap, a reminder of where we're starting from. It's the last years of God's people firmly at home in the promised land. The kingdom's already divided, with the northern kingdom of Samaria, here in this passage often called Jacob, separate from the southern kingdom of Judah, here often called Jerusalem. And Micah preaches during the reigns of 3 kings in the south, before the eventual fall of Judah and the exile into Babylon. And as we heard last time, he opens with news of judgment on God's people, so dreadful that the whole earth will get to hear about it. We know that happened in wars so terrible they shook the entire region, from Egypt in the south to Persia and Media in the east. Why? Well, verse 5 of chapter 1 has an answer. Because of the desecration that God's people have brought to the 2 kingdoms and even to God's own temple. The high places here are a synonym for places of pagan worship, and it's happening right at the center of religious life. We're dealing with a period of history where God's people were split into 2 kingdoms, a period where it would have been easy for those in the southern kingdom to point self-righteously to their fellow Jews in the north and to accuse them of not following God. Adding insult to injury, therefore, Micah here lumps Samaria and Judah together. They're as bad as each other, he says. We'll consider later whether Micah is pointing out the speck in his brother's eye, but missing the log in his own. Verse 7 promises destruction, something that did happen to Samaria around 720 BC. In effect, it ceased to exist as a separate nation, and that was a fate that befell Judah too, sometime later. So, moving on, let's have a look at judgment on the civic life of God's people, chapter 1, verses 10 to chapter 2, verse 6. And by civic life, I mean the ways in which the Jews lived in the local settlements of Micah's day, some of which are listed in verses 10 to 15, and how society operated. I'm not going to deal with this section verse by verse, but try instead to illustrate the general themes. The towns include Micah's hometown of Moresheth and others in that fertile plain of southern Judah. Micah pronounces judgment on all of them, and they were all eventually overthrown. And he uses the meanings of their names to mock them. For instance, Zionan sounds a bit like the Hebrew word for marching, but Micah tells them, don't come out. Shaphir is similar to the Hebrew word for beauty. Micah predicts an ironic reversal. They will be exposed in shame and nakedness. And he mocks the pretentious grandeur and presumably the faith that the inhabitants might be placing in their own civic institutions. It's a bit like us saying, Warrington, you'll certainly see war soon. Hayfield, you won't be harvesting much longer. Castleton, you'll be ransacked. What is it about our modern society that we might place undue trust in, or even pride in? The satire continues in chapter 2, but the focus moves there to the business sector, and more specifically to the rich and powerful in society, as verse 1 notes. And there's a distinct smell of corruption here. These rich, powerful people plot and carry out evil that is gratuitous and chilling, not because they're forced to, but because they can. At the moment, of course, our public focus is on Russian oligarchs and sanctions against Russia itself. But closer to home, do we know what our public and private investments fund? There are some surprising answers, as this clipping shows. According to this article, in 2018, Gazprom was the UK's largest non-domestic gas supplier, with over 20% of the commercial market share across public and private sectors. It can be surprising and shocking even to think what may be being done by well-meaning civic institutions in our name with our money. But back to the passage, and in verses 4 and 5, Micah predicts that the Jews will be humiliated not simply by the confiscation of their own property, but also by the mocking taunts of future conquerors. Verse 5 shows there'll be no comfortable future for those who deprive others simply for their own greed. Again, Micah uses parody, this time to suggest that the land the Jews inherited will be taken away from them in the future, a reversal of the way it was allotted to them when they first conquered the land under Joshua. So, is there any glimmer of hope in this whole section, or is it unmitigated destruction? Let's look at chapter 1 and verse 15. I'm sure you'll have spotted the phrase, glory of Israel. The reference is ostensibly to David, who hid in the Adullam caves to escape Saul, and then was joined by a straggle of family, friends, and rebels. But from that very unpromising start, David's fortunes steadily rose till he became king. Now, I wouldn't deny that strand of meaning, but in context, it also reads ironically. Marishah is similar to the Jewish word for conqueror, and the one who will conquer it soon is going to be Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, not any Davidic or messianic royalty. Yes, there's an undertone of hope, but the heavy overtone is mocking irony, because first, Jerusalem will face judgment. So let's look at judgment on the religious life of God's people. And here the focus turns in chapter 2, verses 6 to 11 on religious leaders. Now, when reading this, it's important to remember that the Hebrew doesn't carry quotation marks, not in its original form. And it makes much more sense to me anyway, if the speech runs to the end of verse 7. That's not quite what we've got in our ESV Bibles, because that reinforces the complacency of the religious leaders. God's patience can't be exhausted, they say. They're presuming on the grace of God, something that we cannot and should never do. It reminds us that there was no shortage then, as there isn't today, of people who claim to speak from God, but because of their sharply different messages, not all of them can be doing so. It requires us to be discerning, to weigh what's said against the breadth of Scripture, and to pray it through. Micah sees this strain of religion as a complete travesty of true faith. In verse 11, he mocks the preachers. We can compare Jesus' words about the rich fool in Luke chapter 12, who says to himself, "You've plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, be merry." The focus is on present comfort, not on preparing the future. These leaders are in fact just as bad as those described earlier in the chapter, despite their claim to faith. They evict women and children from their houses, the very people they should be looking after. I take the speaker in verses 8 and 9 to be God himself, tenderly describing my people. There are several interpretations of verse 8 in the commentaries, but the gist seems to be that the Jews rob people who trust in them of their belongings. They're betraying the faith that people put in them. A characteristic irony from Micah, because the Jews are actually betraying the faith that God has, to this point, put in the Jewish nation. It's a privilege to be a Christian, but it's also a sobering responsibility when we consider how we should treat those around us, particularly, as Paul reminds us in Galatians, those of the household of faith. At this point, now we're well into the passage, let's consider some of the questions I went through at the start. Can God really devise evil, as chapter 2, verse 3 seems to suggest? Well, the ESV translation, which we use at Ford's Lane, understandably is a bit nervous and wobbles a little at this point, with a footnote that says the Hebrew word can mean both disaster and evil, depending on the context. A commentary by our previous pastor, Jonathan Dawson, as yet unpublished, is, I think, quite helpful on this topic. First of all, the facts. The same Hebrew word is used in verse 1, woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds, and when the ESV uses disaster at the start and end of verse 3. We can say that Micah, by this time a practiced master in ironic reversal, is using it again to show God's judgment on those who plot evil. You're devising evil against my people, so I'll devise evil against you. But of course, saying that simply shifts blame from God himself to the prophet who speaks in his name. So it's not much of a get out really for God, is it? Jonathan notes that only the authorized version uses the word evil at the start of verse 3, although many of them conveniently use it elsewhere when it's not linked with God doing the action. As you might expect, Jonathan deals fully, intently, and in my view convincingly with this dilemma. First of all, he says that disaster is not a satisfactory translation to get God out of the dock, because a disaster is a result of an action, not an action itself. And what's in the spotlight here is not only the nature of what happens to these evil people, but the moral character of God in carrying it out. So let's consider what the people in verse 1 are doing. They are in effect exercising a life and death power over others. To be turned out of your property was, to all intents and purposes, the end of life as a Jewish citizen, and, as you had nothing to pass on, the end of your family's future as well. They are in effect usurping God's place in deciding what should happen to others, and they do so out of mere voluntary ill will. By contrast, Jonathan says, God is exacting just revenge, and notice that it's poetic justice, as in verse 4, they will be deprived of their land. He's exacting revenge in order to call people back to himself. Note the language again. Evil from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk haughtily. He's picturing in this image a yoke of enslavement for these evil people. And we know that although enslavement and exile was a disaster for the Jewish nation, it wasn't extermination, because God would bring Jews back to their land eventually. Let's bring in another question at this point. Can God's people ever be beyond hope? In chapter 1, verse 9, Micah says, "Her wound is incurable, and it's come to Judah. It's reached to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem." So if it's incurable, why is Micah bothering to warn the Jews to save themselves before it's too late? Isn't their fate decided already? Now, we don't know exactly when Micah uttered this prophecy, or whether it's a group of prophecies spoken at different times under 3 different kings. But we do know from Jeremiah chapter 26 that Hezekiah heeded Micah's warnings and repented in order to save Jerusalem from invasion. So fateful warnings of doom don't always get fulfilled, thanks to God's mercy. What about here? Again, Jonathan's commentary is illuminating. He reminds us that God's mercy is inexhaustible, but his patience is not. He puts it more directly. If there's one thing worse than turning your back on God, it's God turning his back on you. The message is crystal clear. Turn to idols, and God may just leave you to them. He sees this as a message not just for individuals, but for entire churches, using Revelation chapters 2 and 3 as evidence. And he goes on, a God who wouldn't judge is a God who doesn't care, but Yahweh has shown that he does both. Simonson, another commentator, puts it eloquently. The price to pay for a God who loves is to run the risk of a God who gets angry. Before we close on a more hopeful note, let's consider the role of Micah, here the bringer of bad news and disaster. What is an appropriate attitude for a preacher who brings judgment on his own people? On these days, on his own church. Quite surprisingly, Micah proves a powerful satirist, pulling no punches, pouring scorn on his targets through puns and biting ironic reversals. He makes fun of the priests, imitating their language and their mannerisms. He wags his finger severely at them. Is he the archetype of a hellfire preacher? Well, yes and no. The eagle-eyed among you have probably spotted that till now I've failed to cover chapter 1 and verse 18. It's often said that when we point a finger at someone, it's prudent to remember that 3 fingers are pointing back at us. Most of the commentators I've consulted are very clear on this aspect of Micah's ministry. This short verse shows us that Micah laments and wails the kind of attitude that you'd expect from someone pointing out faults. But he's also, metaphorically I think, going around stripped and naked. In other words, he too bears the shame of his people. Although not guilty of their sins, he identifies wholly with those he's speaking to. Let's remember that he prophesies doom to his own town as well. He must feel the pain of oncoming destruction. One commentator quotes Matthew Henry, the great Bible scholar. The sins of sinners are the sorrows of the saints. We must mourn for the things we cannot mend. So as he utters those judgments, he must be feeling immense pain too. He can't exempt himself from the invasion to come, and in prophesying, he knows he's not making any friends because he compares himself to the jackal, the classic outsider in Jewish culture, and to the ostrich, regarded as the foolish bird. He knows he'll be mocked for these words. It's all too easy to point out others' faults with a blind indifference to our own. In the words of St. Augustine, for those that would learn God's ways, humility is the first thing, humility is the second, and humility is the third. That's easy for us to say from the safety of recording, but very hard to live out. And it would have been very instructive to see how Micah managed it. So I'm sure you've got the message now, mainly bad news. But is there any hope in these harrowing 2 chapters? Well, perhaps it's a little early in the book to see very much of it, but the end of chapter 2 does give a glimmer. Many commentators, Calvin included, have been surprised and even astonished that after 26 verses of unrestrained diatribe, Micah strikes an optimistic note. If we're also surprised, it should be not at the turn in the narrative, but rather at what it signifies, which is the undeserved grace of God. What are the promises here? Firstly, God has not entirely forgotten his people. Secondly, his grace is poured out to undeserving people of all kinds, in this case both Samaria and Jerusalem. There are no first and second class believers in this book. Third, that although this is only a remnant, it's a large enough remnant to make a pretty substantial noise. Fourth, that rescue is only and entirely due to God himself, pictured in verse 13 as the one who both creates the escape route and leads his people to safety. Now, there are historical as well as spiritual truths here relating to the exile to Babylon, the escape route that Jesus opened through his death on the cross, and his eventual return. But it's not a get out of jail free card, because verse 12 reminds us that God is gathering a remnant of believing people. You can only gather a remnant if it's been previously scattered, as the Jews were through the exile that Micah is foretelling. Believers are not promised miraculous shielding from suffering, but they are promised eventual freedom from the ills of this world. As Jesus reminds us in John 16, in the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world. To close then, I think we've come a long way through Micah and through some difficult territory. We've been reminded that God cannot tolerate evil and that his mercy is inexhaustible, but his patience is not. We've seen that a prophet has an obligation not only to preach God's word, but to stand humbly with the people he's addressing. And we're starting to see enacted the great theme of Micah. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah has pointed out the injustices perpetrated by God's people. He's pointed to the mercy that God will show to a faithful remnant in the future. And in doing all this, his attitude is to exercise judgment in sackcloth and ashes. In other words, to walk humbly. We could do worse than to pray we follow his example.